Behind the celebrated wisdom of Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle lies a darker truth rarely spoken of, a culture where the bodies of young boys became instruments of philosophy, ritual, and power. What the Greeks exalted as mentorship, we would now name exploitation. This story reveals the chilling customs that shaped the very foundations of Western thought, and the silent suffering buried beneath their legacy. Step into Athens at its height, marble columns glowing in the sunlight, philosophers debating in the agora, and the air thick with talk of justice, beauty, and truth. To the outside world, this was the birthplace of reason. But beneath the polished ideals was another world, one where the pursuit of wisdom was inseparable from the pursuit of young flesh. The Greeks had a word for it: paiderastia, the love of boys. It wasn't whispered in shame. It was celebrated, taught, and defended by the very thinkers we idolize today. To the men of Athens, philosophy and desire walked hand in hand. They believed that beauty, especially the beauty of a boy just entering adolescence, was a doorway to truth itself. Picture this: an older man, perhaps in his 30s, locks eyes with a boy in the gymnasium. The boy is 12, maybe 13, his body still slender, his cheeks soft with youth. Here, nudity is not just tolerated but expected. The gymnasium is both training ground and hunting ground. The older man approaches, not as a criminal, but as a mentor in waiting. He offers gifts: a hare, a rooster, a wreath of flowers, tokens that signal both admiration and intent. The boy, trained by custom, knows what is being asked of him. His family may even encourage it, hoping that such a connection will bring their son into the circle of educated elites. And what follows? Nights of whispered lessons, where philosophy is spoken between touches. Words of wisdom mixed with caresses. The boy, told this is honor, is drawn into a world where his body is as much a classroom as his mind. This was not an isolated act. It was a social institution. Laws and customs outlined how these relationships should unfold. A man was expected to court a boy, to win him over, to dress desire in the language of education. To the Greeks, this was mentorship. To us, it is abuse wrapped in ceremony. The philosophers themselves did not deny it. They wrote about it, debated it, even justified it. Plato, in his dialogues, speaks of love as a ladder, beginning with the desire for the beauty of boys, climbing upward toward divine truth. For him, the sight of a youth's face, radiant with innocence, was a spark that lit the soul's path to wisdom. But step back and see the boy, not as an idea, but as a child. Imagine the confusion, the pressure, the silent ache of being told that his worth lies in pleasing a man twice his age. Imagine being 13 and hearing that your body is a bridge to philosophy. This was the hidden world of Greek philosophy, not separate from the search for truth, but built into it. The brilliance of Athens was entangled with the bodies of its children. The schools of thought that shaped our world grew alongside customs that normalized the exploitation of boys, sanctifying it as the very path to enlightenment. And this was only the beginning. Because if Athens was the cradle of philosophy, it was also the cradle of a tradition where innocence itself became the price of wisdom. When we picture Socrates, we see a man who walked the streets of Athens barefoot, asking questions that shook the very foundations of thought. He is remembered as the father of philosophy, a man devoted to truth above all else. But behind the noble image lies a more troubling reality. Socrates lived in a culture where wisdom and desire were inseparable, and boys often stood at the center of both. Socrates himself wrote nothing, but his life was preserved in the accounts of his students, men like Plato and Xenophon. Through their words, we see not just a thinker, but a man whose most passionate conversations often revolved around young boys. One name appears again and again: Alcibiades. A dazzling youth, beautiful, ambitious, and destined for power. In Plato's Symposium, Alcibiades bursts into a banquet drunk, confessing in front of everyone that he had tried and failed, to seduce his teacher. He tells the story of lying beside Socrates, pressing his body against him, waiting to be touched, and being refused. It sounds almost noble, the great philosopher resisting temptation. But step back. Why was a boy of Alcibiades' age in that bed to begin with? Why was the intimacy between student and teacher assumed, joked about, and discussed in public, as if it were ordinary? The answer lies in Greek custom. To Athenians, the bond between man and boy was not scandalous, it was expected. Socrates, like many of his peers, spent hours in the gymnasia, where boys trained naked under the gaze of older men. He spoke of their beauty often, likening it to a spark that ignited the soul's desire for truth. His dialogues blur the line between intellectual admiration and physical longing. For Socrates, beauty was not an abstraction. It was embodied in the faces, the voices, and the soft forms of adolescent boys. Imagine the scene: Socrates reclining under a plane tree, a young pupil beside him. The boy, perhaps 13, listens as Socrates questions him about virtue, courage, and love. The philosopher's words are serious, but his eyes linger on the boy's features, and his metaphors slip easily into the language of desire. This was the texture of philosophical mentorship in Athens, a space where lessons and longing intertwined. Some accounts insist Socrates never crossed the final line. But in a culture where boys were groomed into intimacy, how sharp was that line really? Even if he abstained from touch, he was part of a system that invited, normalized, and even glorified relationships in which children bore the weight of adult desire. For Alcibiades, the night he spent beside his teacher became a story retold for laughter and admiration. For modern ears, it is something darker. A boy placed in a position of waiting, hoping, confused about whether he was a student or a lover. His innocence became a matter of public spectacle. And Socrates was not alone. Many of his companions shared the same customs, the same blurring of philosophy and passion. What set him apart was not that he was above desire, but that he turned it into an intellectual puzzle, asking not whether it was right to love boys, but whether one should love their bodies, their souls, or both. This is the paradox of Socrates. The man revered as a moral teacher lived in a world where the education of boys was also their seduction. His wisdom cannot be untangled from that darker inheritance. And as his students carried on his legacy, the lines grew even fainter, especially in the school founded by his most famous disciple, Plato. If Socrates blurred the line between teaching and longing, Plato carved that blur into philosophy itself. His academy, the first great university of the Western world, is remembered as the birthplace of intellectual rigor. But within its shaded groves and marble halls, the pursuit of truth often began with the worship of boys. Plato wrote often about eros, love and desire. For him, beauty was not just a pleasure of the senses. It was a ladder that led upward, from the body to the soul, and finally to the divine. But at the bottom of that ladder stood the figure he praised most often, the radiant youth. In the Phaedrus, he describes the effect of seeing a beautiful boy, the trembling, the heat rising in the body, the wild flutter of the soul as if wings were bursting through the skin. He does not hide the physical charge. Desire begins with the sight of the boy's face, his form, his voice. That desire, Plato insists, can, if restrained, carry the lover upward toward wisdom. But how many men restrained it? The academy was filled with promising young students, many just entering their teens. Their bodies, still delicate, were spoken of as vessels of inspiration. A philosopher might spend hours discussing virtue, only to end the night caressing the hair of the boy beside him. Plato dressed this in lofty words, the ascent to truth, the vision of beauty. But behind the abstractions was a simple fact. The sexualization of children was written into philosophy's very foundation. Picture an evening in the academy. A gathering of thinkers and pupils sit in a circle, debating justice and the soul. At the edge of the group, A boy reclines, his head in the lap of his mentor, fingers idly stroking the youth's curls while questions of morality fill the air. To the Greeks, this scene was not contradictory. Intimacy and intellect fed one another, like wine poured into the same cup. Plato even argued that love of boys was superior to love of women, because it was unpolluted by mere reproduction. Women were for children. Boys were for beauty. And beauty, he claimed, lifted the mind toward the eternal. In that strange equation, the boy's body became a stepping stone, a tool, a spark, a sacrifice for the philosopher's enlightenment. Yet hidden in this noble language is a silent cost. For the boys themselves, what was presented as honor could also be fear. Imagine being 14, praised for your beauty, touched under the guise of inspiration, told that your value lay in how much longing you stirred in men twice your age. Your youth became their ladder. Your innocence, their philosophy. Plato gave these desires a crown of gold, transforming them into a metaphysics of love. But strip away the poetry, and what remains is a culture that turned children into muses, their bodies and emotions bound into the very birth of Western thought. The academy stood as a temple of wisdom, yet its pillars were carved not only from logic and argument, but from the trembling bodies of the boys who sat at the feet of philosophers, boys whose beauty was seen as the first rung on the climb to the divine. And beyond the academy, this custom was no less structured. For in the city itself, pederasty had become ritual, complete with rules, ceremonies, and symbols that made desire appear not only natural, but necessary. By now it is clear that in Athens, desire for boys was no secret. But what made it even more chilling was how systematized it had become. This was not just private lust. It was a public institution, woven into the very fabric of Greek education and civic life. The Greeks called it pederasty, not a scandal, but a ritual. A respected path that linked generations where an older man, the Erasts, lover, would court a younger boy, the Eromenos beloved. Families knew of it. Communities approved of it. And boys were raised to expect it. The courtship often began in the gymnasium. Naked, oiled, and training under the sun, boys were watched closely by men who judged not only their strength, but their beauty. If a man was taken by one, he began the ritual of pursuit. He might offer symbolic gifts, a hare, a cock, or a wreath of flowers, each a token of desire dressed as tradition. Acceptance was rarely the boy's choice alone. Fathers often allowed, even encouraged, such advances, believing they elevated their son's status. A powerful lover could secure him education, political connections, and entry into elite society. To deny such a bond was to risk exclusion. Once the relationship was sealed, the boy's world changed. He became both student and partner, pupil and possession. The man guided him in philosophy, athletics, and warcraft, but also in intimacy. The line between lesson and seduction vanished. A father might send his son to the Agra to learn wisdom, only for the boy to return with gifts, kisses, and bruised innocence. The Greeks even cloaked this in symbols of mentorship. A cloak offered for warmth became a gesture of protection, but also of possession. A kiss presented as encouragement carried expectation. In poems and pottery, scenes of men touching boys, caressing their chins, or leaning in for a kiss were depicted not as shameful, but as noble acts of culture. And then there was the bed. To us, it is where the abuse becomes undeniable. To them, it was another lesson. Some philosophers claimed the highest form of love was non-physical, but others argued that intimacy was natural, even necessary. The boy was told his beauty was divine, his submission honorable. If he yielded, he was praised. If he resisted, he was mocked as cowardly. Imagine a boy of 13, lying awake in a man's home after a day of mentorship. He recites lines of Homer, only to feel a hand linger on his shoulder. He is told this is part of becoming a man, that his body itself is a classroom where lessons are written not in ink, but in touch. He wants to believe it, because every voice around him insists it is true. This ritual, practiced openly in Athens and other city-states, blurred exploitation into education. It turned boys into the canvas on which men painted philosophy, honor, and desire. And because it was framed as civic duty, no one questioned the scars it left behind. The Greeks celebrated pederasty as noble tradition. But to modern eyes, it is impossible to see it as anything but systemic abuse, codified, glorified, and passed down as if it were virtue. And if Athens made it ritual, Sparta made it weapon. There, the bond between man and boy was twisted further into a tool of discipline, obedience, and war. While the gymnasium and symposium were spaces of intimacy, another stage displayed Greek desire in full view, the theater. To us, theater was the glory of Athens, soaring tragedies, biting comedies, myths that shaped Western drama. But hidden within its stories and performances was the same disturbing current, the eroticization of boys. Greek plays, performed before thousands, often wove youthful beauty and forbidden desire into their plots. Playwrights like Aristophanes filled his comedies with jokes about boys as objects of lust, mocking men who chased after them, but never condemning the act itself. In tragedies, youths were symbols of purity, vulnerability, and temptation, their suffering drawing tears, their beauty inspiring longing. And offstage, the theater was even more dangerous. The actors were all male, and roles of women and boys were played by adolescent males. These boys, chosen for their high voices and smooth features, became doubly desirable. On stage, they embodied innocence. Offstage, they were vulnerable to the advances of powerful men who controlled the troupe, the funding, and their future. Imagine a festival in Athens. The theater of Dionysus is packed with citizens. The air smells of wine, smoke, and sweat. A boy, no older than 14, steps onto the stage wearing the mask of a maiden. His body is draped in costume, but the curve of his neck, the softness of his hands, the tremor in his voice, all signal his youth. The crowd roars, not only at the story, but at the sight of him. To them, beauty itself is part of the performance. When the play ends, the applause is not the boy's triumph, it is his invitation. Wealthy men in the audience may send for him later, offering coins, gifts, or promises of training. For these boys, the stage was never just a stage. It was a marketplace of desire. The myths themselves reinforced this culture. Stories of gods and heroes, Zeus and Ganymede, Apollo and Hyacinthus, celebrated divine love between men and boys, turning abuse into mythic precedent. When audiences watched a youth on stage, they were reminded not only of comedy or tragedy, but of a cultural narrative that said, the beauty of boys was meant to be desired. In this way, theater became both mirror and amplifier. The audience laughed at crude jokes about boys, wept at the suffering of young characters, and carried those emotions into real life, where boys themselves endured the same blurred boundaries. The stage did not just reflect society. It trained it to see boyhood as something fleeting, precious, and consumable. For the boys themselves, the theater was a trap. Some may have enjoyed the fame, the attention, the brief glow of admiration. But beneath it lay the same imbalance of power. Adults controlling their roles, their reputations, and their bodies. The mask they wore on stage was only an extension of the mask they had to wear in life, pretending that exploitation was honor. Thus, even in its most celebrated art form, Greek culture reinforced the cycle. The stage that gave us drama also gave cover to desire. The theater, like the gymnasium and the symposium, was yet another arena where boys were placed not just before the eyes of men, but into their hands. And nowhere was this more terrifying than in Sparta, where desire was stripped of poetry and turned into a weapon of war. If Athens cloaked the love of boys in philosophy and art, Sparta tore away the disguise. Here, boy loving was not refined by poetry or softened by gifts. It was weaponized, turned into a tool of discipline, control, and war. Sparta was a society built for battle. Every male citizen was trained from childhood to become a soldier, molded by the state into an instrument of obedience. But this training was not only physical. It was emotional, intimate, and often sexual. The bond between a warrior and his boy was praised as the very glue of Spartan strength. From the age of 7, boys were torn from their mothers and placed into the agoge, the brutal state-run education system. Here they learned endurance, pain, and silence. Hunger, cold, and beatings hardened their bodies. But alongside drills and punishments, another lesson awaited: attachment to an older man. Each boy was expected to form a relationship with an adult warrior, not only as a mentor, but as a lover. The man gave guidance, protection, and honor. In return, the boy gave obedience, loyalty, and intimacy. It was framed as training for battle, the idea being that erotic bonds created soldiers who would fight and die for each other without hesitation. Picture a Spartan camp at night. A boy, lean and barely into his teens, lies beside his armored mentor. The older man's hands, calloused from the spear, now touch the boy with a different kind of possession. The boy endures because he is told this is part of becoming a warrior. Tomorrow he will fight alongside his mentor. Tonight he must surrender to him. To Spartans, this was not shameful but sacred. The state itself encouraged these relationships. A man who refused to take a boy was seen as shirking his duty. Families accepted it as the price of raising sons into soldiers. Desire became discipline. Lust became loyalty. Yet beneath the rhetoric of honor was coercion. Boys had no choice. Their bodies were absorbed into the machine of the state, their innocence sacrificed to bind them into obedience. What Athens dressed up as philosophy, Sparta sharpened into strategy. Writers of the time described it with chilling pride. They claimed the love between men and boys gave Spartan armies their legendary courage. A soldier, they said, would rather die than fail the boy he loved or betray the man who owned him. On the battlefield, this intimacy was transformed into ferocity. In reality, it was a system of exploitation, one that drilled loyalty through the most private of bonds. For the boys, the scars ran deeper than the whips and rods of their training. They learned early that their worth was not only in strength or courage, but in submission. Their bodies became another weapon in the arsenal of Sparta, wielded not for their own growth, but for the state's hunger for power. Sparta is often glorified in modern imagination: fearless warriors, perfect discipline, heroic sacrifice. But hidden behind the bronze helmets and red cloaks was a darker truth. The making of soldiers required the breaking of children. And when the war camps fell silent, another arena of Greek life carried on the same legacy. A space of banquets, wine, and words where philosophy mingled with laughter and desire. The symposium. When we hear the word symposium, we think of high-minded debate, Plato's dialogues, men drinking wine while discussing love, justice, and the soul. But in reality, the symposium was not just a banquet of ideas. It was also a feast of desire, and at the center of it were boys. Picture the scene. A great hall lit by oil lamps, couches arranged in a circle. Men recline with goblets of wine, laughter echoing through the room. At their sides stand boys, servants, entertainers, and sometimes unwilling participants in the evening's pleasures. Barefoot, slender, their voices still unbroken, they pour wine into the cups of their elders, straining under vessels too heavy for their arms. To the guests, their labor is amusing, even arousing. The symposium was built on excess. Wine flowed until speech slurred, songs filled the air, and bodies loosened into abandon. Music was provided not by professionals, but often by boys with lyres or flutes, chosen as much for their beauty as for their skill. Their performance was not only musical, it was physical. A lowered glance, a trembling hand on the strings, the movement of a young body framed beneath torchlight. All of it stirred desire in the men who watched. And the night did not end with music. When the cups overflowed and philosophy gave way to hunger, the symposium shifted into something more carnal. Boys who had been serving wine were sometimes drawn into games, ordered to sing, dance, or strip before the crowd. In comedies of the time, these scenes were laughed at. In life, they were endured in silence. One can imagine a boy of 13 balancing a crater of wine as men twice his age whisper about his figure. A hand reaches out as he passes, fingers brushing his thigh. The laughter grows louder, but no one intervenes. He is property for the evening, whether owned by the household or simply brought in for entertainment. His innocence is not hidden away. It is paraded before an audience already drunk on power, wine, and lust. Even the most revered gatherings were not free from this. Plato's Symposium, remembered as a masterpiece of philosophy, unfolds against this backdrop. Men drinking deep, debating love, while boys hover silently at the edges, pouring and serving. The irony is staggering. Men discuss the nature of pure love while their hands reach for the servants who refill their cups. The symposium blurred every line. It was at once a place of art, philosophy, and predation. A man might deliver a brilliant speech on the immortality of the soul one moment, then take a boy onto his couch the next. The very setting that gave us some of the greatest works of Greek thought was also a theater of humiliation. And for the boys? Silence. They were not asked for consent, nor given a voice in the histories. Their presence was taken for granted, their bodies part of the furniture of the symposium. Their suffering became invisible, drowned in wine, and buried beneath the laughter of philosophers. The symposium is remembered as a celebration of culture. But in truth, it reveals something far more disturbing. The very halls where philosophy flourished were also stages where children's innocence was stripped away, one cup at a time. And when the songs ended and the lamps were extinguished, what remained was not only wisdom, but silence. A silence that echoes even louder in what comes next, the absence of the victim's own voices. Up until now, we have walked through the hidden chambers of Greek life, the gymnasia, the academy, the Spartan camps, the symposiums. We have seen how philosophy and ritual wrap desire in noble words. But there is something missing in all of it. Something louder than the laughter of men, sharper than the songs sung at banquets. Silence, the silence of the boys. In every surviving text, the philosophers debate love, justice, truth. The poets sing of beauty and longing. The playwrights joke about lust, about men chasing boys through streets or across the stage. But nowhere, not in Plato, not in Xenophon, not in Aristophanes, do we hear the voices of the children themselves. We do not know what Alcibiades felt, pressed against his teacher waiting for a touch that never came. We do not hear from the boy who poured wine until his arm shook, while the men around him laughed and caressed him like property. We do not hear from the Spartan youth, lying in the dark beside his armored mentor, told that his body was now a tool of loyalty. What we have are only fragments, pottery painted with scenes of men kissing boys, verses celebrating their soft cheeks and unbroken voices. These fragments tell us what men thought about boys, but never what boys thought about men. And that absence is damning, because history records the winners, the powerful, the writers, not the powerless, not the voiceless. The boys were left behind, erased as if their pain was irrelevant. Yet their silence is not empty. If you listen closely, it screams. Imagine being 13, caught between pride and shame, told you were chosen because of your beauty. You are praised in public, laughed at in comedies, whispered about in philosophy. But at night, you lie awake, heart pounding, not knowing whether the next lesson will be words or hands. The scars such a system must have left are unimaginable. Fear disguised as honor, confusion framed as education, the aching knowledge that your innocence is temporary, that it belongs not to you but to the man who courts you, touches you, or claims you in the name of love. And when these boys grew into men, what then? Did they bury the memory, convinced it was duty? Did they repeat the cycle, grooming boys of their own? Or did some carry the quiet trauma for the rest of their lives, unspoken, unspeakable? We will never know. That is the horror. The philosophers gave us their wisdom, their dialogues, their ideals. But the boys left no words, no books, no testimony. Their childhoods were consumed by men who claimed it was for the sake of beauty, truth, or the state. All we have is silence. And silence, in this case, is not absence. It is evidence. It tells us that behind the shining mask of Greek civilization was a hidden cost. Countless children, whose voices were stolen before they could ever be heard. The silence of the victims is the darkest echo of antiquity. And it follows us still into the legacy of the Western world. We began with marble temples, great names, and noble words. We end with shadows that reach far beyond Greece. Because the disturbing customs we have uncovered were not isolated. They became part of the foundation of Western civilization, a legacy that cannot be separated from the brilliance it produced. Think of it. The very men whose ideas shaped democracy, science, ethics, and reason, Socrates, Plato, Aristotle, lived in a culture where the exploitation of boys was not scandal but norm. Their philosophies of love and beauty were steeped in a system that treated children as instruments of enlightenment. Their schools, their symposiums, their rituals, all of them reinforced the idea that a boy's body could be a pathway to truth. And the world inherited both sides of that legacy, the wisdom and the wounds. For centuries, Western culture revered Greece as the model of civilization. Renaissance artists painted its myths. Enlightenment thinkers praised its philosophers. Politicians and revolutionaries claimed its ideals. Yet in this admiration, a silence remained. The darker truths, the gymnasia, the symposiums, the rituals of pederasty, were brushed aside, forgotten, or excused as different times. But history is not so easily cleansed. The way the Greeks blurred the line between education and exploitation echoes in later centuries. The boarding schools where boys were shaped by older masters. The seminaries where mentorship hid desire. The institutions that claimed to raise men while silencing the suffering of children. The shadows of Athens and Sparta stretched farther than marble and myth. And still, the victims remain voiceless. We can reconstruct the customs, quote the philosophers, describe the scenes painted on pottery and etched into plays. But we will never recover the cries of the boys who lived it. Their pain was buried, erased, sacrificed for the sake of wisdom. This is the contradiction at the heart of Western civilization. We praise the Greeks as the first great lovers of truth, but they were also lovers of boys. Their genius cannot be untangled from their cruelty. The brilliance of their philosophy was born alongside practices that, by today's eyes, were nothing less than systematic abuse. So what do we do with this legacy? Do we turn away from it, pretending the brilliance of Plato and Aristotle was untouched by these customs? Or do we confront the truth, uncomfortable as it is, that the same civilization that gave us democracy and reason also normalized the violation of children? The answer matters, because when we look at the past honestly, we see more clearly the dangers of the present. We learn how easily exploitation can be disguised as tradition, how desire can wear the mask of mentorship, how silence can bury suffering for millennia. The story of Greece is not only the story of wisdom, it is the story of how beauty and cruelty, enlightenment and predation can walk hand in hand, and how the cost is too often paid by those who never had the power to speak. And so, when we speak of Athens as the cradle of civilization, we must also remember it was a cradle lined with shadows. The very foundations of the West were built not only with words and ideas, but with innocence sacrificed and silenced. That is the legacy, and it still haunts us.